Okay, I think that's working. Okay, I'm getting ready to start turn one. Got a few updates on, there's a lot of loose ends still going on with the rules, but I'm going to try to avoid going too deeply into it uh, so I don't drive anybody crazy. But I am going to cover a couple of things. So I've got some issues with strategy one, as I've said. But here, one thing that I'm finding is that in this scenario, at least, I find that the production uh, rate is too high and the production costs are too low. So I have, um, one thing that the current war in Ukraine has shown all of us is that, between combination of supply chains and what you've got on hand and, the level of production you've got. Plus, if you imagine in this game, we've got a country that's broken apart and disparate industries are spread around all over the board. Things are having to be reorganized, stuff like that. Um, you would imagine that, there'd be a certain amount of supplies on hand and some scrambling and make do and makeshift going on. But then there would be a reduction in the capacity over time of each of these powers in the broken up group, and even the two foreign groups, Hussein and Welland. I'm going to say that there's no one. Let's just say no one is ready for war like we seem to believe, or we like to mythologize that Germany was ready for war in World War II. Um, there's just a lot of, things decline pretty quickly and then you make do and you make some things work. So, to solve my problem with the production level and to simulate that, I'm going to have everybody's production capacity drop by between 5 and 10% every 6 months when we do production. Well, no, every single time someone does takes production income. So, if someone goes to war, it's going to happen faster because they'll go down to 5. Or in the case of Shonho, 4, because they have that added advantage. So, go to war quick, you're going to wind up, having the deleterious effects even faster. So anyway, that's going to happen, and I've doubled a lot of the production costs. Not all of them, but a lot of them. I don't know if you guys can see that or not. But just a quick rundown, like for instance, armor's gone from 8 to 16, etc., etc., etc. I have not increased the cost of infantry. I have not increased the cost of a supply unit. In fact, I've lowered the cost in fuel to produce a supply unit from 5 down to 4. And in depots from 18 down to 14 in terms of fuel alone. Carriers went up a little bit from 42 to 48. Light fleets from 16 to 24. Transport fleets went from 5 to 24. Submarine flotillas from 2 to 12. Someone explain that to me. I don't understand why they would have. I don't understand any of these numbers. Maybe they were based on what they thought worked, or maybe there's something about production that just doesn't make sense to me. I don't know. They've got something called attack transports in this game, and those are much less expensive than regular transports, and they're important. I've raised them from 8 to 12. Heavy bombers from 7 to 10. Fighters from 2 to 2 to 5, light bombers from 4 to 8, air transports from 2 to 6, fortresses from 3 to 6, adding rail cap from 3 to 6. So all that stuff is more expensive. Air bases I've left the same at 2. Parachute units I've left the same at 3. So there you go. That's what I've done to try to solve my problem with production levels. I may find, one of the things I thought was that part of the reason why they left production levels so high is they expected a lot of attacks on people's production by bombing, air bombing. And I am reducing what strategic bombing can take on the bombing table from, I think it's 2, 4, and 8 down to 1, 3, and 6. My sense is that it's going to balance out. But if it doesn't, I'll make some modifications. The way the tech table's kind of set up, after you get past about level 4, going into level 7, things have modernized considerably. As a matter of fact, to have aircraft at level 8, you have to rush your production up to level 8 in order to have those types of planes. So, I may find that as we get into, if the game goes on long enough, if you get into a more modern period of capacity in warfare, why some of these costs will what am I trying to say? Some of the strategic bombing might get higher, and maybe even some of the production might increase again as it goes up, to balance it out to compensate if I've over-adjusted. So I've decided that diplomacy is going to happen 4 times a year, not twice a year. When at peace, it's going to happen 4 times a year, whether you're at peace or whether you're at war. It's going to be in March, June, October, and January. Okay, CRT. It looks to me like the CRTs in Strategy 1 are kind of rough. I feel I modified the one for the ancient period a little bit and into the medieval period because I wanted to have some capacity to have die roll modifiers that would, especially from the medieval going into the early modern, that there would be the capacity to modify the combat capacity of units based on the type of units that were being discovered and being able to be produced. But in this period, the CRT, they use the same basic CRT for everything, and they, of course, they do a fairly nifty thing where they have the combat results mean different things. This is done in many games. The combat results mean different things for different types of attacks. And that looks to me like it's going to work for me. It may need some tweaking. I may haul off halfway through and decide that I'm going to use a whole different air combat regime or something like that. But at the moment, I'm going to use the combat table for everything as they have in Strategy 1, with the exception that the ground CRTs are going to be adjusted. With all this talk about production and the effects it's going to have, my view for this scenario and what I'm hoping for is that we're not looking at like a game that's going to model War in the East. Instead, it's going to be the piece density is going to be a little lower. And so I'm looking for a CRT that is less based on, churning through a lot of units and producing a lot of units and that whole process going on, which is probably what they were looking for. And instead, I'm going to use the CRT. Came from a Rhineland, that comes from Rhineland 1936 out of World of War. This is another Joe Miranda game. It's a fun little beer and pretzels kind of lighthearted game about what if World War II started in 1936, and you know the French and the Little Entente and all that stood up to Germany and all that kind of stuff. It has terror bombing in it because people thought that terror bombing was a thing, you know, back, you know, if you think of Things to Come, you know, that old movie, you know, it had, you know, it's like that. And it's a good game, and it's got, I'm not using this part of it, but it's got some random chits that are drawn that make events happen, and it's just a fun little game. It doesn't last too long. You probably, if you know everyone knows how to play it, you could finish it in an evening. It's a good game. I highly recommend it. Rhineland 1936 World at War. The reason I'm going to use the CRTs from that game. And the reason I'm picking that is I want to have, it has 2 CRTs for ground combat. It has a mobile CRT and an attrition CRT. And I like that. And it also, the CRTs are less, they're kind of designed for a game that's going to have less piece density, which is what I'm hoping for this. It's, you know, you lose a counter in a combat, or sometimes you can lose everything, but usually you lose a counter or your most powerful counter in a combat. It depends upon what you're doing. Another thing that game has in it is if you're doing mechanized warfare, obviously you have to have at least 1 mechanized unit in the combat. I may up that to at least half the strength points. I'm not sure. And also in that game, it allows you to double your strength points in attack if you've got a unit, you know, with your zones of control all around it. I may use that. You know, it's a very rough, primitive way of going about that, but I think it might work here, and I'm going to see how I feel about it as I go along. In terms of the partisans, which you can build in this game, I'm going to use the partisan rules from War in the East, First Edition, almost entirely. I'll explain those as they start getting used. Okay, in terms of days of decision, there's obviously no U.S. entry, and there's no League of Nations currently in existence. However, I'm going to use the U.S. entry points for a creation of a League of Nations. And I haven't got it all worked out yet. I'm going to fiddle around with it as we go along, as it forms. Needless to say, in this first turn, there's been a couple of declarations of war against miners. Those have points that go towards U.S. entry, which I will log in. What I'm thinking is that those points won't be counted until a named power. I said in my last video that everyone was going to be treated as if they were a miner. That's more or less the case. I don't want to get into saying major powers for the primary named groups because I'm going to treat them kind of like miners in a lot of ways. But at the same time, there is going to be a distinction. So when the war first happens between 2 named powers, named countries, then these points that have been banked by attacking miners will go into effect. It's going to be used to be able to create a league to your advantage, hopefully, and then hopefully move, because one of the things that I'm going to allow to have happen here is the random rules in days of decision that allow you, not random, what do I mean to say? The optional rules in days of decision that allow you to to move other powers around on the diplomacy display are going to be in effect. And it's going to tie in some with this League of Nations thing. And once you've established a League of Nations, you've got the opportunity to start to form an alliance between a couple of these leagues. Again, as you'll recall, if you saw the last video, the countries are divided up into the different suits, you know, clubs, hearts, spades, and diamonds. Diamonds would not be a part of that because the diamonds are the original country, and they're kind of in the center of the chart. We'll go into that as it becomes important. So, okay, couple more notes. Like in WIF, I am going to allow one unit to move without costing any fuel costs. This game doesn't normally have a fuel cost to move units, but I am going to have one. It's going to be one fuel to move a stack of ships greater than 10 hexes or into any kind of combat. It's going to cost one fuel for every turn that air units do anything more than change base. And I may adjust those things. In Days of Decision, one of the big things that happens is you trade resources with miners, sometimes with other countries, and some with other major powers, in this case, other named minor powers. But you have to use a transport ship in order to move those resources. Not doing that. It is going to be possible, however, to stop the transfer of resources through search and seizure, as is described in Days of Decision 3. And we'll go into that as we get closer to that. Casus Belli is another issue. Normally, these named powers cannot, well, in Days of Decision 3, a major power cannot declare war against another major power. Germany eventually can, once they have mobilized to a certain point. We don't have those mobilization factors involved in this game. It's different. So, but there is, if you recall, I showed you a relation chart between the different countries in the last video, and I can use that. It opens up the possibility of certain casus belli between these named miners based on the overall attitude of the populace of one country towards one power towards another power. I'm just going to call them powers, or countries, powers in between. They're not really countries yet, because what they are is this is a broken up empire, and they're regions. So between regions, maybe I'll start saying regions. That leaves some opening for, I'll show it to you real quick when it becomes important. It leaves some openings for declarations of war between named powers, regions, without having to get a casus belli. Casus belli, of course, are still possible through the normal creation of terms, around the game, where you would get a casus belli. Let's see. That's all I'll say about that at the moment. Finally, miners. Well, a note about zones of control, and also a note about miners. I'll do the miners first. The minor countries, which are just one little state provinces, as I showed you last time, they can draw supply from any resource or city or fortress. If they attack, they're shifted left one column, unless a named power is involved with their attack or provides a supply unit in some form, either because they built one for them and sent it over, or helped them build one, or they're in the country and there's a supply unit available to them. In which case they can go ahead and attack on the normal column. Zones of control. We're using the zones of control rules for strategy 1. Normally we would be using 9.3, which basically eliminates all zones of control. But I'm not comfortable with that. We're going to arrive there, but what we're going to do is mechanized forces and all non-mechanized forces. Mechanized forces that are level 1 through 3. You'll remember I showed you that I've added as a tech mobile warfare. Mechanized forces that are mobile level 1 through 3 and all non-mechanized forces will use the 9.4 zone of control rules, which basically you can move through an enemy zone of control by paying an additional 3 movement points. As you reach levels 5 and 6, each of those levels will reduce that cost by 1, and once you arrive at level 7, you can start using the 9.3 rules where you no longer pay attention to zones of control. I'm stating that it will be, until you have level 4 mobile warfare, you cannot create an armored or mechanized corps. If you don't have that level and you start with an armored corps, it will suffer a -1 DRM every time it attacks till your side reaches level 4.